more successful PS1 titles and one huge party game in Crash Bash, Crash Bandicoot at long last finally entered the 6th generation, with a less than optimistic future. Wrath of Cortex's development remains shrouded in mystery. Initially, the game started out in the direction of Mech Suit, who wanted to make Wrath of Cortex, which at the time was simply Cerny's unnamed PS2 title, a free-roaming game with puzzle elements. Traveler's Tales eventually followed suit with this when they released footage of Crash running through a volcano level. It ultimately sounds like a very ambitious project, and I actually think that the sequel, Crash Twinsanity, used some elements from this idea. Well, it all fell apart when Universal partnered with Konami. This caused Crash Bandicoot to stop being a Sony mascot and instead become fully integrated with Universal. Whatever fallout happened, Mech Suit was kicked off the project in favor for making a more traditional Crash title. But they only gave Traveler's Tales 12 months to develop it, and as they always say, the rest is history. And how was the final result? Well, let's just say that if the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games are the juicy Angus beef burgers you get at Red Robin's, Wrath of Cortex is basically the McDonald's Quarter Pounder. You know what it's trying to be, but deep down you also know it's not really it. And this doesn't show itself to be more apparent than the title introduction, which is probably the weakest of all the Crash intros out there.
Crash Bandicoot, the Wrath of Cortex.
Man, Clancy Brown, did they not pay you enough for this one? Usually these sequences are filled with energy and vim. But with this one, it's, well... Oh boy, here we go. But maybe I'm casting my cards too quickly. Maybe Wrath of Cortex is able to find some redeemable qualities in its... Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear. So yeah, a bit of a note to take that these character designs have really taken a nosedive compared to what we saw in the previous generation. It all just looks kind of stiff, like the movement is robotic. Cortex's eyebrows look a bit too furry for his face, and it looks uncanny how they're always slanted. Engine literally looks like a lab rat, while Tiny's mouth is always gaping open like Mara Wilson from Thomas and the Magic Railroad. So you all have probably already played this game, so I'm not gonna waste time trying to explain the story, but then again maybe I will. Uka Uka and Dr. Cortex went to use the elemental masks to power Cortex's secret weapon, Crunch Bandicoot, so that he could destroy Crash. The Bandicoots need to traverse around the world, collecting crystals to lock up the masks and stop Crunch and Cortex for good. A simple enough story typical for Crash Bandicoot titles, right? Well, it generally is. However, I feel that the way it's presented kind of gives away that this was rushed. Whether it's the way that Entropy haphazardly brings up the secret weapon Cortex has been slaving on for years, or the idea of the elementals suddenly appearing in Uka Uka's mind.
But the power source is the final missing crucial element.
It all is incoherent in how it's laid out, and basically reflects the writer's process when writing this game's script. Alright, time to write the story for this new Crash game. Okay, but how should we make this one stand out compared to the previous titles? I know. How about we have Cortex use another Bandicoot? I guess in Crash 3, Uka Uka somewhat haphazardly shows up, but Cortex wasn't like, hey, let's release Uka Uka from imprisonment. It was more dramatic with the way he was introduced. Here, they were just bouncing around ideas and that just happened to be the best one. Although, I will say this, even though it is just another typical Crash story, they do take the liberty to tell it in a different way.
The setup is that the villains have already won, and the heroes have to clean up the mess they've left behind, as seen with how Cortex releases the elemental masks into the world, and Crash needs to collect crystals again to lock them up. But even here, the game runs into some problems. First of all, the game doesn't show the elementals making hell on Earth. It's just a couple storm clouds, one tsunami, and that's it. We, the viewer, are left to assume that these elemental masks are somewhat a threat. Most of the levels don't seem too affected by their powers of mass destruction. In fact, the best threat that they give you is when they insult you in the between-level cutscenes. And, well, does this sound scary to you?
Oh, I'm gonna shake, rattle, and roll your Bandicoot butt.
Yeah, exactly. So the game basically has a weakness of telling, not showing. I can't take the elemental masks seriously because we're simply told that they're dangerous, but we don't see them doing anything. Plus, the characters themselves are one note and overall very stereotypical.
I realize my brethren have had some trouble with you, my little orange friend, but I'm not quite sure why. Is it getting hot in here? Is it safe to be wearing that fur? It looks flammable!
Yeah, the game has an all-star cast, but as is the case with a lot of things with this game, it's never used to fullest potential. Kevin Michael Richardson as Crunch, otherwise Gantu from Lilo and Stitch, kind of just comes across as the really tough brunt that tries to give Crash a hard time. They do something interesting with him in the middle of the game by having him not want to use the elemental masks, but it doesn't really go anywhere because he still uses them. You get the sense the writers really want to go in that direction where he rebels against Cortex, but they come across as a bit restrained when writing him. And then the other voice actors, I guess, are okay, but it doesn't matter since the characters they play as might as well be sidelined. This was the debut of Debbie Derryberry's role as Coco, and she's fine for all I care, but other than unveiling the warp room in the intro, she kind of just doesn't feel like she plays much of a role. And the same can be said for the voice talent of all the other elemental masks. They kind of just make one annoying comment and then leave. In fact, they kind of have the same caricature-like characteristics of the Winds of Destruction. I can probably attach one song from Metal Gear Rising to each of these masks.
Rules of nature, and they run when the sun comes up, with their lives on the line, alive for a while, no choice, gotta follow the rules of the wild. And it will come like a flood of pain pouring down on me, and it will not let up until the end is here, and it will come through the darkest day in my final hour. It will never rest until the clouds are clear, until it finds my dreams have disappeared. When the wind is slow and the fire's hot, the vulture waits to see what rots. Oh, how pretty! All the scenery, the red sun over paradise. Here I am, dirty and faceless, waiting to heed your instructions. On my own, invisible warrior, I am a wind of destruction. Standing here, I realize you were just like me, tried to make history, but who's to judge the right and wrong? When your guard is down, I think we both agree that violence breeds violence, but in the end it has to be this way.
Although I will say that I really like Cortex using his own sense of self-awareness when talking about how you have to collect crystals again.
Still gathering crystals? Old habits die hard, don't they? My days are being spent on something much more intriguing.
and I guess that's a good way to describe the gameplay. So Wrath of Cortex plays almost identical to Warped, with a few minor exceptions. A lot of the normal platforming stages are the same as what we've seen in the first 3 games. However, if there is one thing I'll call out, it's that the controls feel slower, and this especially affects the jumping. I'm honestly not quite sure what it is, but I think it has something to do with the jump not having enough weight behind Crash, that it feels as if he floats a little bit, thus making it hard to judge the distance between nitro crates or whatever obstacle stands in your way. And then there's also the fact that moving on monkey bars is slower than driving down the road at a 15 miles per hour speed limit. So in that sense, Wrath of Cortex feels like a watered down version of Warped. It might feel the same, but if minor things like the jumping aren't polished, it makes me feel like I'm playing an unrefined version of Crash Bandicoot. My god. It just... like, how long does this have to take? Although in terms of the level design, most of them tend to be relatively standard for Crash Bandicoot. Platform your way through a path while spinning away enemies. Once in a while you'll come across a death platform that takes you up to a secret area in the level or a bonus stage. So yeah, generally it's the same except for one aspect, the vehicle sections. Now variety can be a good thing. However, the way that Wrath of Cortex uses variety is that it can get in the way of the levels. So you might be swimming when all of a sudden you're forced to continue in a submarine. Or you're going in a jetpack when all of a sudden you're forced to continue on foot. And it wouldn't be so bad if the vehicles were at least half decent. So, very well then. Here are all the vehicles in Wrath of Cortex ranked from worst to best. At the bottom of the list is the Mech Suit. Quite honestly, this thing has a jump that can be very hard to gain momentum with, and trying to aim using the reticle forces you to stand still in order to take aim at an enemy, which basically kills the pace. Then you have the submarine. This one wouldn't be so bad if there were not so many friggin' mines falling from the ceiling, which forces you to inch forward steadily just in case a mine falls on top of you. The scuba gear. Identical to Crash 3, except now you have to be wary of obstacles just popping out of nowhere, which, again, makes you inch forward at a snail's pace. The jetpack. For a vehicle that shows up in just 2 levels, its control scheme is very complex with the whole face button usage. It doesn't even last for more than half the level. The Firefly. This one would be a lot higher in the list if it hadn't been for the fact that it only shows up once. I despise trying to aim with this thing, especially with the fact that you have to wait for the reticle to lock on a target instead of going full-on rapid fire. The biplane. Just the same as last time, except now you have to worry about planes kamikazing into you. And the Atmosphere. Feels weighty to control, and I don't know, I just had the most amount of fun going through these, especially when you were falling at full speed in these myriad of obstacles. The only downside is how they backseated the bosses of Warped into half-hearted dummy obstacles. Oh wait, I've forgotten to talk about the Jeep, the scooter, and the minecart. See how many gameplay styles there are? It's like Traveler's Tales didn't say no to any of this. So you might be wondering, now wait a minute, you praised the vehicle sections in Warped, so why is it that you are right now brutally attacking them in Wrath of Cortex? Well, Warped didn't have any of the vehicle levels disrupt the pace. If there was a level that wanted to be a jet ski level, it was a jet ski level. If there was a level that wanted to be a biplane level, it remained a biplane level. The constant switching that Wrath of Cortex goes through makes a lot of the levels feel like multitask central, as if I have to master these gameplay styles, since I'll never know when it might switch to a submarine or a mech suit. Another thing is that the vehicles in Warped were at the very least functional. Maybe I had some trouble with the motorbike or swimming underwater, but compare that with Wrath of Cortex, in which I had a lot of issues with the controls, and sometimes the hit detection is off, and it just all came together as messy as my work desk instead of a game that feels good to play. Variety can be a double-edged sword. Speaking of variety, Traveler's Tales tries to expand on Crash's moveset from the previous game. One of Crash's new abilities is to tiptoe over nitro crates. Let me ask you this. Under what circumstances will you need to tiptoe over nitros? Only if they're positioned in a straight line, and this almost never happens unless the situation calls for it. Whoa fucking who. Traveler's Tales was trying so hard to create something new that they made something that made the game feel even worse to play. I guess this is a good time to talk about the bosses. They mainly involve you fighting Crunch while he's powered by another elemental mask. Well, they're mostly a hit or miss. Rocco's boss suffers from the fact that you have to fight him inside of the Atmosphere. The entire arena is curved, so it's very easy to run into Crunch's boulder and take a damage. Still not too hard, since all you have to do is turn the boulders to your respective color. It's just frustrating to control and not very fun. The next fight is Drain Damage, which is a battle against Wawa. In concept, it's not too hard. Jump across these platforms in order to get to Crunch. However, because Crash's jump arc is very weighty, it can be hard to judge how far you need to jump to dodge the lasers. There's also the fact that you can't remain on a platform for too long of a time, otherwise you sink. For the most part, I know this will shock many, this boss was not as difficult as I anticipated. However, I'd still say that this is a rather dull boss fight at the same time. Just jump, crouch, and jump over to him, spin him, then rinse and repeat. Thankfully, the Pyro boss fight is a lot better. This boss is fast-paced with how it tests your dexterity in dodging the molten rocks Crunch throws at you. Yeah, the Mech Suit can be a little stiff to use, but it doesn't really require too much, because you're running towards him in a straight path while dodging bombs he lays. Unfortunately, you're back into biplane with Lolo's boss fight. There's just so little to say about this one. I did it in one try. And I don't know, it was easy, I guess. I guess I can ask, how do you dodge that one attack when he brings down the energy blanket? And finally, we get to the final boss, where Crunch basically uses all 4 elementals to his advantage. This is actually a pretty good boss fight, all things considered. The only thing I will mention is that Aku Aku states that the elemental masks were imprisoned using 5 power crystals, but here they're still all alive. Bit of an inconsistency there, eh, Traveler's Tales? So overall, the boss fights are hit or miss. You have the average ones, the good ones, and the really bad ones. And the same can be said for the levels. While you have levels like Crash and Burn, Gold Rush, and the Gauntlet, which provide good platforming challenges unique to the game, you also have Cortex Vortex, which basically starts you in the beginning of the level with Crash facing the camera as if this was setting up to be a chase sequence. And then there are these electric gates that you have to somehow meander around, but since it's really hard to judge the depth perception, it's so easy to just run into the gate and get yourself zapped. Also, the checkpoints in this game are separated far apart, so even if you get past the electric fences, if you die, you have to do it over again. To be honest with you, quite a few of these levels would have been really good without the inclusion of vehicle sections in the middle of them. Maybe if they had played it a little bit safer, this would have been a decent game because most of them feel so unnecessary. And I almost forgot to mention this, but for the first time, Coco Bandicoot is fully playable. And just like all the vehicle sections, it's completely unnecessary. She basically plays identical to her brother, except everything is watered down. Her spin cannot cover the same amount of ground that her brother can, not to mention her sweep kick does jack shit. It's funny considering they really advertised this to be a major addition for the game. Well, it certainly sounds like I'm already laying into this game. Is there anything good I can say about it? Well, yes, actually. So while everything else about this game sucks and kind of makes it feel like I'm playing a watered-down version of Crash Bandicoot, the soundtrack to this game is outstanding. Take Wuthering Heights. The mix of electric guitars and bongos really makes it feel like I'm inside of a technologically powered area while still feeling like I'm playing Crash Bandicoot. Or how about Bonsai Bonsai? Hell, Gold Rush plays a lot with chromatic scales and triplets to create a riveting piece. So overall, if there is one thing to write home about in regards to Walk, the soundtrack is at least pretty good. But sadly, that's all I can say towards Wrath of Cortex. It just doesn't leave me with anything. I don't think I'd call it a game that's necessarily bad, but it is one that I'd describe that makes me feel like I'm playing a watered-down version of Crash Bandicoot. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just kind of meh, and by the time I was done with it, I was like, okay, that was it? Traveler's Tales really did not have the time to pull this off in 12 months, and it shows. The thing is that the core gameplay of platforming and jumping is all there with Crash Bandicoot. It's just that all the new things they tried to add just muddles the game and leaves behind an unpolished product. In other words, what could have been just wasn't there. And then that leaves another one biting the dust.